Welcome back. You are watching Business Insight. This is a special coverage of the State of the Nation address. Now, we have in studio Reginald Kadzutu. He is an economic and policy analyst and would like to just delve into the meaning of that particular State of the Nation address, especially what it means to the economy. Reginald, you listened to this particular address by the President. What do you make of those pronouncements?
Thank you, Betty. I think the first key thing is to actually set what the state of the nation is. After listening to the President for some few seconds, I was wondering which nation is he talking about, because the true state of the nation is a nation that you have close to 60–70% of people still using charcoal, firewood and paraffin for cooking. The true state of the nation is where you have close to 60–70% of the people still using pit latrines as a form of waste disposal. The state of the nation is where you have less than 20% of the people that have access to piped water. People are still using water from dams, rivers, lakes, and wells.
All right.
The true state of the nation is where you have majority of the people, their houses are still made out of mud, cow dung, or stone with mud, and all. So if you look at the reality of what is there on the ground in terms of the status of the nation, then it becomes very hard to marry the President's speech to what is actually the status of the nation as a country. So I would have expected the President to address some of these things, but from his address he seemed to pick big business over people.
Big business over people. Well, to be fair to him, he was pretty honest about the condition of the country in terms of the Covid-19 pandemic, how that has impacted livelihoods, and just what the government is doing or has been doing for the past 8 or so months to make sure that people are at a better place than they could be if they were just left to suffer. What do you think? Do you think that the government has done enough during this Covid-19 period to ensure that people can at least survive through this pandemic?
I will not agree that they've done enough, especially on the economic side. My theory is that, number one, they misdiagnosed the issue to be a liquidity problem. I think you've heard the President mentioning it many times in his speech, that to sort out liquidity, but the crisis that we are facing as a country, or the crisis we are getting into, was actually going to be an income crisis. Income crisis by that people's incomes were going to disappear, corporate income was going to disappear. So if you look at the number of jobs that have been lost, so that is income that has been lost. So when people lose jobs and income is also lost, aggregate demand in the economy also drastically drops. So you end up in a vicious cycle where they continue to shed more jobs, and the aggregate demand continues to drop, and now you get companies closing down or scaling down on production. So what the government should have done is, how do you substitute that income that has been lost, or how do you sort out that aggregate demand that has gone missing in the economy? So the government should have played the role of the largest aggregate demand during this period. So the measures of reducing tax, for example, yes, you've reduced tax, but I've lost my job. So that tax break is not actually going to help me. If you give me more money because you've reduced my PAYE, does not mean I'm going to order 4 loaves of bread. If I only take 1 loaf of bread, I will still continue taking 1 loaf of bread. The rest, most probably, I'll put it under the pillow, or put it in the bank. The bank takes it and gives it to the government in terms of buying government bonds. The government goes to pay salaries, or some of it is taken by corruption. So I think the government misdiagnosed the problem and put measures that have actually not helped people, especially on the side of income and protecting jobs.
Okay, and just to link it to what you've spoken about, the loss of income, there was the issue of the ease of doing business, about 400,000 jobs being registered annually. He said that during the corona period, 300 jobs, or not jobs, rather businesses, were being registered on a daily basis. Based on these numbers, do you think that it reflects the improvement in ease of doing business, or is it just a reflection of the desperation that is going on within the people after losing their jobs and maybe their sources of income?
If you use a statistic of saying people have registered a company, registering a company does not mean the company is operational. I can just register a company for the sake of having or protecting the name, keeping the name on the side, or to try and get into a tender or something. If you want to really measure your ease of doing business, you try to look how much foreign direct investment is coming into the country, with people coming either to set up manufacturing plants here or set up offices here. If that number was 200 a month, then we'll say yes, all the efforts around ease of doing business are working. But if you look at the cost of electricity in Kenya alone, we are not competitive in the region, and even in the continent, we are not even in the top 15 in terms of cheap electricity. Two, our tax regime is very punitive, and it has a lot of uncertainty. It changes every fiscal cycle. Every year the CS for Treasury is giving a budget, there's a whole overhaul of the taxation. So even just based on those two things, the number 56 of ease of doing business, if it does not translate into companies coming here or businesses that we are seeing that, because when a business is registered, ideally we are expecting that people are going to be employed. But if you're having businesses that are not creating employment, then those businesses are not helpful to the economy at all.
Mm-hmm. So he spoke about the issue of the production being a production-based country and not a net importer of goods. You've spoken about the cost of energy and the ease of doing business. What more can be done to ensure that we reach that point where we are maybe net exporters and not net importers?
I think the government needs to first accept the state of the nation. The condition that we are in. Secondly, then the government needs to accept the comparative advantages that we have as a country. Majority of our people are in the rural areas. Majority of the people are employed in the agricultural sector. Our manufacturing sector is 80 to 90% agro-processing. So our manufacturing sector cannot operate without the agricultural sector. But if you look at the funding that goes to the agricultural sector, it has been dropping. I think it's around 3%. The Maputo declaration says it's supposed to be at 11%. Mm-hmm. So if we are going to see moving us from being net importers to net exporters, then we need to look at where we actually have a comparative advantage, which is the agricultural sector. We are not going to export Volvo cars. As much as we are attracting Volvo to set up manufacturing plants, we are not going to export a Volvo car here to the region, because it's cheaper for them to import it from elsewhere. So how then do we increase our production yields from the land that we have? How do we mechanize? It is shameful to say right now that the land under irrigation versus the agricultural land is 0.04%. That shows you the level of mechanization that we have, where the largest sector of the economy is dependent on God. If he sends rain and he keeps the locust away, there's no policy that is actually being put in place to actually make sure that we are mechanizing the agricultural sector to increase the incomes in the agricultural sector, which will impact 70% of all the people that are employed. When those incomes start growing up, the surplus income can now go to the other manufacturing sector, adding value. He talked about cotton. He talked about Rivertex. If you look at cotton right now, most of our EPZs that do exports to the US of apparel, most of that cotton is imported. And I'm thinking it's not sustainable. Why not find a piece of land where we are saying we are growing cotton because we want to focus on apparel making, on clothing. So I think there's a lot of no policy that is really directed towards saying step by step we are going to move in this direction. And I like one thing that he said is that some of these things cannot be done in one presidential cycle. But our problem is that we always try to do everything in one budget cycle. You want to do the whole Galana in one budget cycle. You want to do laptops in one budget cycle. You want to do SGR in one budget cycle. You want to do Nairobi's Express road in one budget cycle. What does that lead to? It leads to debt and more debt and more debt. And more debt.
Well, he spoke about the pending bills in the parliament, and one of them is the National Aviation Management Bill, which, if enacted, will see KQ nationalized. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't think nationalizing KQ is the only solution to Kenya Airways. There are a lot of things that Kenya Airways needs to go through the process. Nationalizing KQ is a good step in the right direction. if it gets the benefits that come with nationalization, if they're not going to give KQ tax breaks, if they're not going to give KQ VAT breaks on their fuel, if they're not going to waive the lending rights and the lending costs for KQ at JKIA, then this nationalization will still keep KQ running a loss. So if they're going to nationalize it, they need to then look at what is ailing KQ. Ailing KQ is not because it's a private company. It's because of, one, it's heavily taxed. Two, there's a lot of privilege that goes on at Kenya Airways that needs to be fixed, and I'm sure the current CEO is doing quite a good job on that. They need to optimize the cost for running the airline, their employee cost, the running cost of the aeroplanes, because it's profitable. If you look at the revenue that they generate, you realize KQ actually generates a lot of revenue. They actually generate revenue to the level of close to the same level as Safaricom. If nationalizing means also the government is going to wipe out all the debt, then it will make sense. But if they just nationalize for the sake of bringing it under a parastatal, we all know how the government runs parastatals. Look at Kenya Power, look at Ketraco, look at the sugar firms, look at most of the things that the government owns as parastatals, they all end up running losses. So unless they nationalize KQ and treat it the same way they treat Safaricom, then we will not see a real change coming through in Kenya Airways.
Right. Back to the issue of the COVID-19 management, you said that it is more of an income issue than a liquidity issue, rather. Now, are there any international models that have been used by other countries during the management of this COVID to ensure that money is in the people's pockets, and maybe something that Kenya would have borrowed from?
If you look at most of the developed countries, we can take the US, for example. Donald Trump was signing checks to give to people. To the majority of the people. Here in Kenya, it's shrouded in mystery. Who is actually getting these 2,000, 4,000 things that they give per week? Is it even enough? So if you look at a stimulus package of 50-something billion that the president mentioned in an economy of 9.9 trillion, that's less than 1%, 2% of what we of our GDP. It's not going to actually have an impact. So you either do income substitution, which is what the US did. They also printed money straight into the stock market, buying goods to make sure everything continues running. In Kenya, I think we've had a lot of talk, but we're actually not implementing some of the things that we are talking about. And I think the size of the stimulus was too little and targeted at, when you start getting young people cleaning trenches and picking litter in terms of kazi kwa vijana, in terms of helping them, then you delay paying them. Right now, even the desks that they ordered, we had the vendors complaining that they have not been paid for that time. So the stimulus package was little. There needed to be more of income substitution for the economy, and there had to be more of an aggregate demand. I would rather have the government going to say to UNGA, I will buy this amount of UNGA from you guys, so that UNGA keeps all their employees employed and keeps on producing. As UNGA keeps on producing, they will buy more maize from the farmer. The farmer then can keep their workers and pay their workers. All of a sudden, you're keeping the demand side of the economy running. And that way, it was going to be a bit better. So that it needed to be slightly bigger, close to 200, 300 billion for it to actually have an impact.
Okay, and moving forward, maybe, is there a way that a country can prepare for such a shock to the economy to just lessen the impact so that we are not where we are right now?
Reducing our indebtedness will be one good thing, because it gives the government room to borrow at a large scale, especially in cases of emergency like this. But with where our debt is close to 7 trillion, your room to even borrow drastically reduces. Number two, if universal health care, which he mentions in his Big Four, makes sense if it is implemented well, because then you will not be fearing right now. Everyone will have an NHIF card that actually pays for COVID, not just for the sake of we are being cut for NHIF and doesn't do anything. if they had taken enough time to actually upgrade our hospitals, to make sure that we have facilities to handle such type of pandemics and the skill sets to handle such type of pandemics. If you look at the people that are churned out of our universities, we are churning out close to 1.5, 1.7 million anthropologists, philosophy, accountants, finance guys. Where are the scientists? Why are we waiting for a vaccine from elsewhere? So there's a lot of investment that needs to go into research and development in the health ministry. The infrastructure needs to increase on a nationwide scale, so that when a pandemic comes, you have the capacity to actually handle it without having to now saying, oh, we need to make hospital beds, or you need to create hospitals in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
So as we come to a close of this, what would be your parting shot?
Parting shot that I'm not sure which nation the president was addressing in the State of the Nation. I believe our state of leadership is to bury our heads in the sand and assume everything is well. But based on the statistics that I've just shared here, and which are just a few of them, you realize what we're trying to do as a government does not actually address the problems that we have on the ground. And I think it comes from where policy needs to think of people and stop thinking of goods, roads, railways, and actually think of people. Then you realize the policies we'll make as a country will be policies that actually address the problems that Kenya actually faces. That
Kenya actually faces. Thank you very much, Reginald Kadzutu, there for speaking with us. He is an economic and policy analyst, and we have been talking about matters the State of the Nation addressed, just giving his views on those numbers shared by the president, what they mean and what the president could do.